My name is larí Garcia. This exhibition is titled Spirit Discrimination, stemming from my visitation at La Casa de las Almas, or the House of the Souls. This meeting hall is a historic meeting hall that was founded in 1928. That's the oldest meeting hall in the Caribbean. The show is adapted from these transcriptions that were recorded in the space during the meetings. In the transcripts themselves came a lot of conversations around misogynistic, like gender kind of notions that were kind of like seeping its way into the religion. And so each week there was like 4 sessions. One was on issues of contemporary violence. There would be a conversation about like what is happening in the news, and we talk around it as like kind of like an alternative way of learning about the doctrine. And then there would be like a session on mediumship where we became practitioners and we practiced in the space together. And there was an observation of like how that information is translated in practice, what's the ethics around it. The goal is to like be able to like strengthen the muscle in order to use it to help other people. So it became like more about like being a conduit and like learning how to communicate intangible things. And my initial draw to visiting the House of the Souls, or La Casa de las Almas, was to understand how the immaterial becomes material, and also to kind of figure out the dividing lines between like Catholicism, 18th century French Spiritism, and the knowledge that's indigenous to that area, in Puerto Rico specifically. When I started studying with them, I didn't have a direct vision. I was very open to seeing what would I find. And I didn't necessarily know exactly what that form would be, because it could show up, the materiality of the immaterial could be so many things. And so I started focusing on conduits of like communication that's ubiquitous. So newspapers, like telephone lines, like other forms of like what we can like root ourselves onto. Because I know mediumship is like, it is like very intangible. And so I'm looking for like very tangible things to kind of be those conduits to a certain degree of like disembodied voices. With the wall drawing, it's a drawing of kind of this electrician who was like suspended and like kind of trapped in these telecommunication lines and electrical lines, and was eventually electrocuted in suspension. And so this is the reference photos like of a evidence image. There's like a lot of really interesting iconography when it comes to electrician unions with the crucifixion. And so there's like this is really interesting spiritual correlation between like electricity, energy, and this like labor of like climbing up, that I feel like is like a really interesting context to talking about communication onto the other side. What I really wanted to play with within the exhibition is like different layers of perspective of, yes, quite formally like background, middle ground, foreground, but how these veils kind of change the shape. There's a moment in which the viewer in the space can reveal specific aspects, because you don't really see exactly what's inside until you peek around the corner. The use of found objects throughout the exhibition is part of my own like sculptural practice language, where I feel that every object or material has its innate history, regardless if it's like a social or political history. And I think it has like a greater language around different kind of groups of people creating objects or materials, allowing trade networks. So it's like this greater conversation I feel that a lot of materials have innately, and that is occurring like in the space. There's a lot of wet sculptures. There's a treatment on the plastic here that of condensation. So the gourd themselves, because of its position, it cannot hold water, it cannot like hold or retain its like original use. Through these other objects that like are made for containment but no longer contain, is like this like porosity that I like to occur in the exhibition. Kind of the notion of like having things off balance, like things in balance are like not seen as direct conduits. Because of all of that, I was thinking a lot about containment and like what specific objects, furniture or whatnot, what kind of containment does it have or does not have. And so the sand being kind of this like grounding element inside the wall barrier, with like objects kind of surrounding it, became more of like an unstable structure. right? Like the kind of this different sayings around like building foundation on sand, and also it's a very like a formal decision in different ways of just kind of allowing things to not feel like they can be contained because they just kind of spread very easily. There's this kind of like also underlining tone of the exhibition that is like on the newspapers outside, where it's these kind of this correlation between like rising domestic violence cases with like rising heat and like climate change, and so like this like correlation of building compounding violences kind of merging. I was always interested in like learning about religion and learning about alternative modes of accessing our own like life and other perspectives. But I was more curious on mutations. And so Spiritism is like a very deep mutation of many religions. Being Dominican and my dad's Cuban, there's this innate cultural mutation. It's like a specific crosshair. So understanding these ways in which things merge is interesting. What I want the viewer to kind of take away from the information provided and like the title of the exhibition, Spirit Discrimination, is to give a breath of, even within alternative religious practice, although sometimes they are platformed to be kind of the solution, it's like okay to critique the structures that we have. And I think it's like more of like to shed where language kind of fails in these spaces to a certain degree, and kind of like the pushbacks that happen in these spaces. There was a lot of pushback as far as like, you know, discriminatory language that was being occurred in the space. It's just allowing for critique to like occur is important, because I don't think any spaces, any religious space or any spaces for that matter, is like perfect in that degree.